Power Query has an incredible number of features that are dedicated to helping you clean and prepare your data for analysis. And so what I want to look at is the sorts of things that we can do to clean your data and shape your data in preparation for creating reports. We've got Power BI up as we last left it in the last video, and now I want to trigger Power Query. So I go Transform Data. This brings up Power Query on my right hand side, and I can see I've got 14 queries on the left hand side of my Power Query editor. First thing I want to do is look at removing top rows. Sometimes we get a lot of data that we actually don't need, and so we want to remove rows. Let's start with the bike products by month query. Give that a click. Now what you can see here is there is a number of rows at the top here that we simply don't need. And so to remove rows, in the Power Query editor, there's actually a button called Remove Rows. And I'm just going to resize my screen a little bit so you can see it more clearly. So I'm just going to drag this over to the left a little bit. And there it is there, Remove Rows. Now if I reduce my screen width, notice how the button changes to reduce rows and looks different to your notes a little bit. So be aware that your screen size does have impact on how big your buttons are and where they appear, and sometimes even the labeling of the buttons. So I'm just going to widen my Power Query so that those two buttons pop out and are a little bit clearer to see. So here is a button that allows me to reduce rows or remove rows, and not just the top rows. It actually offers to remove the top rows and however many you say, so n number of rows, but it also removes the bottom rows, alternative rows, any rows that are duplicates, and it even removes blank rows and even removes rows that contain errors. So how helpful was that? What I would like to do is I'd like to actually remove the top 3 rows. So I'm going to remove top rows, and then this window pops up and says, well, how many rows do you want to remove? So I just put 3 in here. When I click OK, the other thing you're going to notice in my steps on the right hand side is there'll be an extra step because I've removed some rows. So I'll go OK to that, and there it is there. There's my extra step, remove top rows, and notice how it has removed the top 3 rows. Now if I wanted to undo that, the thing with these steps is there's no undo button in Power Query, and that's because it's not necessary. If you want to undo that step, you would simply go over to the Applied Steps area and notice that each one has an X in front of it. And that's how you're able to delete a step. So if I hit the X here, I can actually delete that step and it goes back to how it was, which is sort of like undo. Let's say I go back in here and I go remove top rows again, and let's say I only say remove 2, and I go OK. The 2 top rows disappear, the step appears in my applied steps, and then I think to myself, oh, I meant to remove 3. Now I could go and remove another row, or if I go into this little cog, which is the settings, I can get into that settings of that step and change the number of rows that that step removes from 2 to 3. And so if I go OK now, it's going to remove 3 rows instead of removing 2 rows. So rather than add another step, just get into the settings, that little cog there, the settings of a step, and customize it. So removing rows is really handy. Now I'm looking at my data and I'm thinking January, February, March, these should be column headings. So I want to promote this first row to become a column heading. And I've got a button that does that. This button here, use the first row as headers, is what I want to apply. In fact, let's have a look at the drop down. What else does it do? Use the first row as headers, or use the headers as a first row. So that's the inverse. If you've got column headings and you want them to actually become a row in a record, you would use headers as first row. But we actually want to promote the first row up so it becomes the column headers. So handy feature. So I'm going to use this button here, and there it has moved my first row up, and now they're column headings. And here it has promoted the headers, so that's it, under remove. But it also felt compelled, by promoting the headers, it felt compelled to create another step and reassess the data types of these columns. So that's what that's done. When I promoted the headers, it just made these text, ABC, 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 but when it detected the data types and had a good look at those columns, it changed the data types to number, number, and number. And so it actually added an extra step for us, which is a good thing. So that's a couple of things that we can do, is removing rows and promoting headers. Now, the other thing I want to have a look at is the fact that when you click this little button, for example, this is another way in which you can remove top rows, bottom rows, alternate rows, just like we did. So that's handy as well, just that little button there as an alternative to using the buttons up here in the ribbon. But what else do we want to do? What we want to do now is maybe do some things with columns. We've done things with rows, now let's look at columns. As far as, first of all, selecting a column, you can just hit the column heading and that allows you to select columns. But what if I want to select a range of columns? Click the first one, hold the Shift key and click the last one, and that entire range of columns is selected because maybe you want to delete a range of columns. Or if I click one column, hold the Control key, I can choose very separate and discrete columns. So hold the Shift key for a range of columns, or hold the Control key to select specific columns. Now there is another option, and that's this button here, Choose Columns. When I'm sitting in the January column, for example, I can choose columns or I can go to column. If I choose columns, this lovely window comes up and I can untick the ones I want to not choose and tick the ones I do want to keep. So that's a way of choosing columns as well. But what I'd like to do is remove some of the columns that we have in this particular query. And I also want to look at renaming and some of these columns. So the first thing I want to do is get rid of this first column. It really hasn't got any value that I'm looking for. So I click on this column here. I could right click, that's another way, remove. Or I could go remove columns and remove columns, or remove all the other columns except this column. So that's another very powerful yet dangerous feature. Remember, you can always delete the step if you choose the wrong option. So if I remove all other columns, let's do that, it's removed everything but that column. Then I just delete the step and I get it all back. If I want to remove that specific column, then I'll choose remove columns. And whatever columns I had selected have effectively been removed. So I've removed the first column. Now I want to rename this column here, instead of _1, which is not really helpful, I'm going to double click its column heading. That's one way. Or some people will right click and they'll rename a column just by choosing the rename option here. Or some people will just press F2, which is also one of my favorite keys. F2 is edit. And I can edit this column and say that I want to call it bike product. So rename the columns something meaningful. Now the other thing you can do besides renaming the columns is also you can rename the queries. And we did this in an earlier video, but I want to do it again. So for example, we've got a query here called Sales 2021. And I want to rename that Sales 2019 to 2021. So one way is to go to here in the properties and just rename it in there and press enter. And so I've renamed that query. Another way, of course, is to right click and simply rename it that way, or to click it and press F2, which will allow you to rename it also. Another query I want to rename is the orders query. So I'm going to click on here, press F2, and I'm going to call it orders 1997 to 2000 and simply press enter. So renaming a query that way. And queries 2, I actually want to press F2 and just call that orders. So you can easily rename your queries and rename your columns. Now the customers table, which is here, I actually don't need that query anymore. And so to delete this query from my data model, I've got a variety of ways. I could just hit the delete key, that would get rid of it, or I could right click and choose delete this way. But I do want to get rid of that. It says, are you sure you want to delete this particular query from your data model? And so I delete. And so customers is gone. And this customers too, I want to click it, press F2, and actually rename it customers. And so I've tidied up my queries. Now, the query steps, we've been looking at those quite a bit, and I think we're okay with that. Let's just bring in another data source and step back a little bit. So I'm going to, in my Power Query editor, I'm going to go to New Source, and it's an Excel workbook. So I'm going to choose Excel workbook, and the name of it is Target and Actual Sales by Region. Oh, just target and actual sales, sorry. Open that. When you get to the navigator window, that's when you say you want sales by region. Getting ahead of myself. When I tick that option there and go OK, because it started this from within Power Query, it'll load that query as my 14th query at the bottom of my list because it's the latest one I brought in. And then I want to transform the data a little bit. I want to use this top row here as my column headings. So I head to this button, use first row as headers, and it's done that, and it's added that step, plus it's reassessed the data types, much like it did before. I want to remove the grand total column, so I click that column and I go remove columns, and that's gone. And I want to remove the grand total row, which is row 12. So I click row 12 and I go remove rows and remove bottom rows and just the first bottom row. So I'll put a 1 in there and okay. And so that removes that bottom row. I want to rename the first column. So I'll click and then double click and I'll call it region and press enter. And really I now need to bring that sales by region. I need to load that into my fields pane in my Power BI. So I'm going to close and apply, or I could just go apply and it will just load those changes into my Power BI, but not close Power Query. So close and apply applies it to Power BI and closes Power Query, where apply will just apply it to Power BI and keep Power Query open. And sometimes that's more desirable. Now we haven't saved this file at all, and I would like to. I could either use this save button here in the Power Query editor, or I could use this save button over here in Power BI. Both of them will work because it's one file at the end of the day, so it doesn't matter which side you go for. I'm going to hit the save button in the Power Query editor, and I'm going to save this file to my desktop, and I'm going to name it model. And I've actually got another one there, so it will just say, do you want to replace it? And that's fine, yours won't do that. And when it creates it, it's a PBIX, so a Power BIX file. So I'll go save, do you want to replace it? Yes. And so I've created my model file.